The world had already shifted under their feet before they ever laid eyes on the mess hall tray. The German soldiers, once confident in the superiority of their army, were stunned first by defeat, then by captivity. They had heard rumors, whispered stories among troops in the field, that in American prison camps the food was extraordinary, but none believed it until they tasted it. From the moment the first POWs arrived at camps like Camp Ruston in Louisiana or Rhine-Wiesenlager along the Rhine, the difference was shocking. The smells, the portions, the variety. In Germany, rations had long been slashed. The home front was starving. The Wehrmacht's kitchen trains and supply lines had collapsed under Allied bombing and blockade. Meanwhile, in the camps, the POWs saw kitchen facilities stocked with supplies, cooks moving with resources, and lines of tin trays waiting to be filled. One former prisoner recalled the first time he saw the mess line. Bread rolls, meat, vegetables, soup, even chocolate. The irony was sharp. These were enemy hands feeding them, and far better than they had eaten in months. Some prisoners of war hesitated at the trays, wary. They had been conditioned to think shortages, lack, rationing, not abundance. But the hunger overtook them. They took food, hesitant at first, then eagerly, the laughter that had once accompanied ridicule. "We'll starve before the English feed us," died in the first bite. The taste of warm soup, meat, potato, apple, things they had not seen for years, was disorienting. Some soldiers wept. Others shared rations with weaker comrades. In many camps, the German POWs ended up receiving the same food served to American soldiers in some instances. At Camp Ruston, for example, the German prisoners ate much the same as their captors. This was not mere charity. It was part of a system, a difference in logistics, in mindset, in national capacity. The Allies had built an industrial behemoth. Their supply chains crossed oceans. Their bases were fed by fields far from battlefield wear. They could afford to feed armies and still keep surplus. German POWs were not spoiled. They were awakened. Yet not all reactions were joyous. Some prisoners balked, guilt, shame, memory of starvation. Some believed it must be a trap. Others joked darkly, "This is what we mocked. Now we eat it ourselves." But the body speaks loudest. As days passed, the men gained weight. Their energy returned. Their strength slowly restored. Their jokes changed tone. They stopped mocking the inferior enemy food. They began to ask why their own country could not do the same. These changes created tensions inside the camps. Guards and prisoners negotiated over portions. Smuggled rations from Red Cross parcels, meat, chocolate, tobacco, became currency. German cooks in camp often supplemented menus. The difference was not just in variety, but reliability. American supply chains delivered daily. German supply lines during the war had failed, and behind every feast was a lesson in industrial power. The Allies had shown that war was not won by ideals alone, but by the ability to feed, supply, and sustain. The German prisoners consumed that lesson, one spoonful at a time. The laughter that once rode German arrogance had turned bitter. In silence, they learned that victory demands more than technology or bravery. It demands abundance. It demands logistics. In the food line, German POWs tasted the fault line in their own nation's strategy. The shock of abundance never quite faded. For many German prisoners, the first days of captivity in Allied camps were not defined by violence or fear, but by astonishment. They had expected vengeance. Instead, they were handed plates. At Camp Shanks in New York, Camp Algona in Iowa, and scores of other facilities across the United States, German POWs discovered that the Americans fed them better than the Reich had in its final years. Eggs, meatloaf, potatoes, butter, coffee, even desserts on Sundays. The irony was sharp and inescapable. One prisoner later wrote, "When we saw the food, we thought it was propaganda. Then we tasted it for the Americans. This treatment wasn't sentimentality, it was policy." The Geneva Convention of 1929 required humane treatment of prisoners, including food equal to that of the captor's own troops. And the United States, a nation built on supply, industry, and order, made it a point of pride to obey. In a war where ideology had consumed humanity, this adherence to rules was itself a quiet victory. German officers were humiliated. In the Wehrmacht, food had long been tied to discipline and hierarchy. Officers ate well, soldiers did not. In American camps, that divide vanished. Officers and enlisted men stood in the same food line, trays in hand, waiting like everyone else. Some found dignity in that equality. Others found only shame. But for the ordinary soldiers, the reaction was something deeper, almost spiritual. To them, food was not just sustenance, it was proof that the war was truly lost, that their superior nation, which had once claimed to feed Europe, had starved its own sons while its enemies shared bread with them. Letters smuggled back to Germany told quiet stories of disbelief. "The Americans eat like kings," one POW wrote home. "They even throw away food we would have killed for." Another wrote, "We mock their mass production. But they have mass-produced everything, even comfort." At Camp Ruston, Louisiana, the camp newspaper, written by the POWs themselves, published articles about American food culture, industrial farming, and even recipes. What began as ridicule slowly turned to curiosity, then respect. The prisoners learned that what they had dismissed as crude, assembly line cooking was part of a larger truth, the power of a nation that could turn abundance into a weapon. Back in Europe, their families starved. The winter of 1944 to 45 was one of hunger and cold. The Allied blockade had shattered German logistics. Cities like Cologne and Hamburg burned under constant bombing. Bread was rationed by the ounce. Butter was a dream. Many POWs learned through Red Cross parcels that their loved ones were living on turnips and watery soup. That contrast, the full plates in captivity versus the empty tables at home, crushed whatever pride remained. By the spring of 1945, the laughter that had once echoed in the barracks when Allied rations were served had vanished. The jokes, "Ah, American canned food for the conquerors," gave way to silence and shame. Food, of all things, had revealed the collapse of an empire. They understood now that the war had not been lost merely on the battlefield. It had been lost in the factories, in the fields, and in the kitchens. And yet, in the hum of the mess hall, as spoons scraped against trays, a strange peace settled over the men. They had been defeated, yes, but they were alive. They were fed. The very people they had been told were weak and decadent had shown strength and mercy. Many of them would remember that not as humiliation, but as awakening. By the summer of 1945, the war was over, and for millions of German soldiers held in captivity, a new kind of struggle began. The struggle to understand what had happened. Behind the barbed wire of American, British, and Canadian POW camps, daily life revolved around the same small rituals: roll call, work detail, mail delivery, and above all, meals. At first, those meals were a source of astonishment, but as the weeks turned to months, astonishment turned into reflection. The prisoners began to talk, not about battles or medals, but about bread, about how the Americans could feed their enemies 3 times a day, while Germany had failed to feed its own people. It was a question that haunted them. In Camp Algona, Iowa, a group of POWs kept journals. One of them, Private Franz Mueller, wrote, "When they brought us the evening meal, beef stew, potatoes, bread with butter, I thought of my mother. She would have cried to see so much food. She still believes we are starving here." For many like Miller, that food was the first tangible sign that the Reich's promises had been lies. Propaganda had told them that Allied nations were starving, weak, incapable of sustaining a modern war. But every bite of bread, every can of fruit cocktail proved the opposite. The Americans didn't just have more, they had enough to share. Some German officers at first insisted it was a trick. "They feed us well now," one captain told his men, "but wait, it's only to make us soft." Yet weeks passed, and the rations remained steady. The food was plain but generous, and always on time. That consistency, that simple reliability, was something the soldiers had not known in years. Back home, German civilians were boiling weeds to survive. In POW camps, their captured sons were gaining weight. It was a cruel irony of war, that defeat brought nourishment. Many prisoners began to study the American system with fascination. They saw that food, logistics, and morale were connected, that a nation's ability to supply its troops was as vital as its ability to fight. Allied victory, they realized, was not just a triumph of weapons, but of organization, of industry, of planning. In Camp Shanks, some POWs were assigned to work in American kitchens. There, they saw the vastness of the effort. Crates marked Chicago, Omaha, San Francisco, arriving daily. Bread baked by the ton, meat packed and frozen, sugar and coffee distributed with military precision. To them, it seemed like an endless river of abundance. One prisoner said quietly to a fellow cook, "We thought they were soft because they love comfort. Now I see, they are strong because they make comfort possible." Even those who refused to speak English found themselves adopting American habits. They drank coffee, something rare in wartime Germany, and learned to enjoy canned fruit, peanut butter, and even Spam, which had once been the subject of jokes. They watched the guards eat the same food they were given. There were no officers' tables, no luxury for rank. To many German POWs, that equality was as surprising as the food itself. The laughter that had once filled the mess halls now came with a different tone. Not mockery, but humility. A kind of awakening had begun, slow and quiet, born not from lectures or punishment, but from simple meals shared in peace. Years later, when many of those men returned home, they would speak not of hatred or humiliation, but of food, of the moment they realized that the enemies they had been told to despise were capable of mercy and fairness. For them, the taste of Allied food had become the taste of truth. By late 1945, the German POW camps in America had settled into a strange rhythm. Not quite freedom, not quite imprisonment. Days were structured, predictable, almost mechanical. But in that routine, something profound was happening. The kitchens, once a place of complaint and mockery, had become classrooms of quiet revelation. In Camp Concordia, Kansas, thousands of German prisoners worked side by side with American cooks. It was there that many first encountered the industrial miracle that had sustained the Allied war effort. Rows of ovens turned out bread by the hundreds of loaves. Steam kettles simmered with soup and stew. Every calorie was counted, every ration logged. To the Germans, used to shortages, substitutions, and improvisation, it seemed almost unbelievable. They marveled at how the Americans wasted nothing, yet always had more. The flour came from Nebraska, the meat from Texas, the vegetables from canneries they could barely imagine. One prisoner, a baker from Hamburg, later said, "In our army, we could not even get yeast. Here they bake bread as if the war never touched them." The food became a mirror, showing them the difference between two worlds. In the Third Reich, everything had been built on hierarchy and obedience. The German soldier was expected to suffer for glory, to endure hunger as proof of strength. But in the American army, even in its treatment of prisoners, comfort was not weakness. It was order. It was proof that the system worked. The German POWs began to see how deeply the war had deceived them. They remembered how their officers had laughed at the Allied armies, calling them undisciplined, materialistic, incapable of sacrifice. Yet it was the Allies, not Germany, who had kept their soldiers fed, their supply lines unbroken, their morale high to the very end. In camp libraries, some prisoners began to read American newspapers, even history books, trying to understand the society that had defeated them, not just by guns, but by production. They saw that American power came not from cruelty, but from cooperation, from millions of workers, farmers, and engineers united by purpose. One diary entry from a camp in Texas read simply, "They fight with their factories. We fought with our pride. Now I see which is stronger." For many, that realization was painful. Pride had been their last defense, the belief that German precision and discipline made them superior. But each meal, each steady portion of bread and stew, chipped away at that illusion. Some officers resisted the change. They forbade their men from praising American food, insisting it was propaganda. They held secret lectures, trying to preserve the old faith that Germany had only lost because of betrayal, not inferiority. But it was a losing battle. Reality was too visible, too tangible, too undeniable. The simple act of eating became an act of transformation. Bread, soup, coffee, these were no longer just food. They were lessons in humility, in equality, in the quiet strength of a nation that believed victory was something shared, not seized. Even as the prisoners longed for home, they began to absorb that lesson. When they returned to Germany, many would bring it with them. A different idea of power, one built not on domination, but on cooperation. For now, though, they sat in the warm kitchens of captivity, surrounded by the smell of bread and the hum of machinery, and tried to understand the world that had fed them better in defeat than their own nation had in victory. The laughter had changed. It was no longer scorn. It was the sound of men learning what strength truly meant. By the start of 1946, the German prisoners of war had spent months, some even years, under the stars of another continent. The war that had once filled their every waking thought was now only an echo, replaced by routine, rations, and reflection. But in the quiet monotony of captivity, small moments began to reveal something greater than any speech or sermon could have taught. In the camps of Texas, Oklahoma, and the Carolinas, breakfast came with the same predictability as sunrise. Steaming bowls of oatmeal, slices of bread, sometimes eggs or fruit, and most importantly, coffee. That coffee became a symbol, bitter yet steady, always there, every day. At first, the Germans mocked it. Brown water, some called it, the drink of farmers, not soldiers. They compared it to the thick, black brews of home, rich and strong, the kind they had shared in cafes before the war. But as weeks turned into months, they began to see the meaning behind that cup. One POW from Bavaria later wrote, "It was not the taste that impressed us, but the fact that it was always there." The Americans could lose ships and battles, but never their coffee. Food in its abundance became the quiet proof of something they had never been allowed to believe, that a free nation could outlast a disciplined tyranny. The Americans didn't feed their prisoners out of pity. They fed them because it was right, because the Geneva Convention wasn't just a treaty, it was a reflection of values. In Camp McCain, Mississippi, one German lieutenant, once a proud Panzer officer, found himself assigned to help in the kitchen. At first, he was humiliated. To serve food to men he once commanded seemed beneath him. But over time, he began to take pride in it. He learned the American system, how nothing was wasted, how each man, regardless of rank, received the same portion. He later confessed in his post-war memoir, "We believed order came from command, but here it came from fairness. Every man ate the same bread. That was their strength." The meals were simple, stews thick with beans and meat, loaves of bread baked daily, potatoes and vegetables from nearby farms. Nothing exotic, nothing indulgent. Yet for many it was more food than they had seen in years. Letters home told stories that were almost unbelievable to their families. "We are treated better here than at the front," some wrote. "The food never runs out." In a Europe still starving under ruins and ration books, such words sounded impossible. American newspapers occasionally mentioned the German POWs, sparking quiet controversy. Some citizens wondered why their former enemies were eating so well when Europe's civilians suffered. But the War Department defended its policy. "We feed them because we are Americans," one official said, "and because we will not become what we fought against." That principle, simple but profound, was not lost on the prisoners. It was in its own way a form of re-education, not through propaganda, but through consistency. Each meal served was a silent message. Strength built on compassion is stronger than cruelty built on pride. The laughter in the camps changed tone once again. Where once it had mocked, now it carried warmth. The laughter of men rediscovering humanity in an unexpected place. They laughed at the absurdity of it all, that they had come to America as conquerors in chains, and found instead the meaning of civilization. In one camp in Nebraska, a group of German officers prepared a Christmas meal in 1946. Roast chicken, bread pudding, and even apple pie made from donated fruit. They invited their American guards to share it. For the first time, there were no sides, no ranks, no enemies. Just men sharing food under the same cold stars. The war had taken everything from them, their homes, their country, their illusions. But in captivity, over coffee and bread, they began to rebuild something else: respect. Because respect, they realized, was the one thing that could not be conquered, only earned. And in that respect, born not of power but of dignity, the first seeds of reconciliation were planted. By the spring of 1946, life in the American prisoner of war camps had settled into rhythm, a strange kind of peace within barbed wire. The guards, once wary, now spoke casually with the men they had fought. Work crews went out each morning to harvest crops, repair roads, or build barns for local farmers. And every evening, without fail, the prisoners returned for their meals. The Americans fed them 3 times a day, always enough, always on time. It was a promise kept even in the smallest camps, from the dry plains of Texas to the humid pine forests of Georgia. At first, the Germans had been suspicious. "No one feeds prisoners this well," they said. They expected cruelty, deprivation, the same treatment they had seen meted out to captives in their own war. But as the months passed, suspicion turned to confusion, and confusion to quiet respect. One POW from Württemberg later recalled, "When the guards lined up for food with us, something changed inside me. I realized that we had built our world on hierarchy, and they had built theirs on equality. That was the true difference between us." The food itself became part of the rhythm of understanding. There were stews thick with vegetables and beef, cornbread sweetened with molasses, and pies made from the season's fruit. When they first arrived, many Germans laughed at these strange, sugary concoctions. But in time, they began to crave them. One camp sergeant remembered, "They mocked our beans. They mocked our gravy. But by winter, they were asking for seconds." The laughter had changed tone again. It was no longer bitter or mocking. It was the laughter of men discovering small joys amid captivity. The Americans did not serve these meals out of indulgence. They did so because of an idea that the treatment of prisoners reflected the moral strength of a nation. For them, feeding an enemy with dignity was not weakness. It was proof that democracy could afford compassion. In Camp Shelby, Mississippi, the commandant often said, "If a man eats well, he can think well. And if he thinks well, maybe he won't come back to fight us again." It was simple logic, and it worked. Letters from the POW camps began to reach Germany. In towns still rationing bread, families read in disbelief about their sons eating meat and fruit in America. Some refused to believe it, assuming the letters were censored propaganda. But it was true. In one letter home, a former Panzer officer wrote, "They treat us not as enemies, but as men. If this is what their country is like, then perhaps we never understood what we were fighting." For many prisoners, mealtime was when the silence set in. Between bites of food, they remembered what they had lost: comrades who would never see home again, cities reduced to rubble, families scattered across the ruins of Europe. The contrast was impossible to ignore. The abundance on their plates versus the hunger of their people. Some could barely eat for guilt. Others forced themselves to, saying quietly, "We must live. Someone must remember." Over time, the guards noticed something remarkable. The same men who once joked arrogantly about the inferior food of the Americans now volunteered to cook, clean, and serve it. The meals became a shared ritual, not between victor and vanquished, but between men who had survived. In Camp Atterbury, Indiana, one American lieutenant recalled watching a German cook pause before serving a tray. He looked up, smiled faintly, and said, "It's strange. This is the first time I have ever cooked for peace." It was not the food itself that changed them, but what it represented: stability, fairness, and a kind of humanity they had forgotten could exist. The meals reminded them that nations could fight with strength and still act with mercy. In those small acts, a steaming bowl of soup, a loaf of bread, a cup of coffee poured without hesitation, the German prisoners found something that no ideology had ever given them: perspective. And as spring turned to summer and the days grew long again, the laughter in the camps faded once more, not from arrogance but from understanding. Because sometimes silence speaks louder than pride. By the summer of 1946, the camps had changed. The barbed wire still stood, the guard towers still cast their shadows, but the spirit inside was no longer that of enemies. The Germans were thinner now, tanned by months of labor under the American sun, but their eyes had softened. They no longer carried themselves like soldiers of a fallen empire, but like men rediscovering the meaning of ordinary life. Every morning began the same way: roll call, work assignments, then breakfast. Coffee, sometimes weak but hot. Bread, often white and soft, a rarity in wartime Europe. Eggs when they were lucky. For men who had grown used to scarcity, it was abundance beyond imagination. One prisoner wrote in his diary, "At home, our families survive on potatoes and dreams. Here, I eat like a king behind wire." At first, many Germans felt shame. To eat well while their homeland starved felt like betrayal. They spoke little during meals, their heads bowed in quiet guilt. But slowly, something changed. The act of sharing food began to bridge an invisible gap, not just between prisoners and guards, but between the past and what could come next. One American cook, Sergeant Tom McAllister, remembered a moment that stayed with him for life. He said, "We were serving stew one night, and one of the German fellows, a young one, maybe 20, looked at me and said, 'You feed us better than we fed our own.' I didn't know what to say. I just told him, 'That's the point.'" The meals had become more than sustenance. They were quiet lessons in humanity. Between spoonfuls of stew and slices of bread, the Germans began to see the difference between strength and cruelty, between discipline and dignity. Many had grown up under the propaganda of superiority, taught that the enemy was weak, decadent, and morally corrupt. But as they watched American guards share food with them, joke with them, and treat them as equals in small everyday ways, their certainty began to crumble. One captured officer confessed after the war, "We were raised to believe mercy was a weakness, but here I learned it was a strength." In the evenings after the day's work, the prisoners would gather in small groups. Some played cards, others wrote letters, and many simply talked. The topic that came up most often was the same: food. They would describe the strange American dishes they had grown to like: corn pudding, peanut butter sandwiches, sweet coffee, and soft pies with fruit they hadn't tasted in years. They laughed now, not at the absurdity of it, but in disbelief that such simple things had once seemed alien. A young prisoner from Hamburg wrote home saying, "We mocked their food, but it fed us more than we ever deserved." Perhaps the real strength of the Americans is not in their weapons, but in their generosity. As harvest season arrived, many POWs worked alongside American farmers. They picked cotton, harvested wheat, and stacked hay under the open sky. At noon, they ate together, sometimes even at the same tables. The farmers brought sandwiches, cold milk, and pies. The Germans, once so proud of their heritage, began to realize they were tasting something deeper than just food. They were tasting freedom, the simple, everyday kind that comes from fairness and respect. One farmer's wife in Texas recalled years later, they'd sit in the shade, eat their sandwiches, and listen to the radio. You could see it in their faces. The war was gone from their eyes. Back in Germany, however, starvation was spreading. Cities were still in ruins, food was scarce, and the black market thrived. When letters arrived from the camps describing fresh bread and full meals, many at home wept. Mothers wrote back pleading, "Stay alive, eat. We will rebuild when you return." And so the prisoners did. They ate, they worked, and they learned. For the first time, many of them began to see the war not as a contest of nations, but as a tragedy of ideas. They had fought for an empire that promised greatness and delivered ruin. Now sitting with bowls of stew and cups of coffee in enemy camps, they were being shown what true strength looked like, not in domination, but in compassion. One German wrote in his journal simply, "We lost the war long before we lost the battle. We lost it the day we forgot what it meant to be human." In the mess halls of those POW camps, a quiet transformation was taking place, one meal at a time. And though no speeches were given and no banners hung, the lessons learned there would outlast the barbed wire, the guards, and even the war itself. For sometimes the simplest act, breaking bread with one's enemy, can rebuild what violence has destroyed. By late 1946, a quiet change had taken root across the American POW camps. The laughter that once carried bitterness now carried warmth. The men who had mocked their captors' food were no longer soldiers of the Reich. They were men rediscovering humility, one meal at a time. Breakfast began with familiar smells: coffee, toast, oatmeal, and sometimes bacon. To the Americans, it was routine. To the Germans, it was astonishing. The same men who had once laughed at American rations now stood in line early, holding tin plates, waiting with patience and even gratitude. One of them, a former sergeant from Bavaria, later recalled, "The first time I tasted their porridge, I thought it was dull. The fifth time, I thought it was life." He wasn't alone. In those simple meals, there was a quiet kind of mercy. It was not victory food or punishment food. It was just food meant to sustain life. And for the men who had lived through the winter of 1944, that meant everything. The Americans didn't change their recipes for their prisoners, but they changed something far greater. They changed the tone. Meals were served on time. Portions were fair. There was no cruelty, no mockery, no reminders of defeat. It was, in a strange way, equality, one that shocked many Germans who had been taught that the victors would humiliate them. A letter from a German lieutenant, written from a camp in Kentucky, read, "We expected vengeance. Instead, we were fed." He went on to write, "They could have starved us, but they did not. They could have beaten us, but they gave us work. We had prepared for hate, and they gave us bread." The guards, too, began to see their prisoners differently. They were no longer faceless enemies, but men trying to survive, and sometimes trying to change. Some guards even sat with them during meals, talking about baseball, farming, or home. A few shared family photos: wives, children, dogs, images that reminded the Germans that their enemies were not monsters, but fathers and sons just like them. An American corporal later told a journalist they were human again once they started eating like humans. In many camps, the Germans were given the chance to cook on weekends. At first, it was awkward. American ingredients, German recipes, and a lot of trial and error. But the results surprised everyone. One day in a camp near Oklahoma, a group of POWs prepared Kartoffelsuppe, a thick potato soup with onions and herbs. They offered it to the guards, half expecting rejection. Instead, the guards cleaned their bowls and asked for seconds. That day, something shifted. The meal wasn't just a soup. It was an exchange, a bridge between two worlds that had spent years trying to destroy each other. Food became a universal language in those camps, one that didn't need translation. When a man offered a piece of bread, he wasn't declaring loyalty or surrender. He was acknowledging something deeper, that both sides, after all the killing and the pride, had been hungry. One POW wrote in his journal, "The Americans have shown us that kindness feeds the soul as much as bread feeds the body." Another wrote, with a touch of quiet wonder, "We used to think our rations were superior because they were German. Now I think food is superior when it is shared." Not every camp was kind. Some were harsh, some indifferent, some shaped by bitterness that war never washed away. But even in those places, the prisoners remembered the meals. They remembered how food became their teacher, how it revealed the difference between the ideology they had followed and the humanity they had forgotten. Many began to reflect on their past, not with pride but with clarity. One officer wrote after his release, "I once believed victory justified everything. Now I know that only compassion justifies victory." In the darkness of the barracks, after dinner, the men would sometimes talk about home, what they would eat when they returned, what they would plant, what they would never take for granted again. They spoke of their mother's bread, of beer in the summer sun, of potatoes and onions and salt. But always the talk circled back to the same truth, that food in its simplest form had saved them twice. First from hunger, then from hate. By the time repatriation began, the laughter in the camps had changed completely. It was no longer the laughter of arrogance, but the laughter of men who had survived and learned. When the trucks came to take them home, many left with full stomachs and quiet hearts. Some even shook hands with their guards, thanking them for meals that had meant more than just sustenance. And as one German prisoner wrote before boarding his transport back to Bremen, We came here as soldiers. We leave as men. When the first ships carrying German prisoners of war began docking at Bremen, Hamburg, and Cuxhaven in 1947, the men stepped off not as conquerors, but as ghosts of a world that no longer existed. The Reich they had once served had vanished. The cities they remembered, Berlin, Dresden, Cologne, were now hollow shells, their streets paved with dust and memory. For many of these returning soldiers, the first shock was silence. Germany, once filled with the roar of marching boots and speeches, had fallen quiet. The flags were gone. The uniforms meant nothing. Even the laughter, once the proud, mocking laughter of men certain of victory, had died. The second shock came with hunger. Food was still scarce in post-war Germany. Families rationed every crumb. Children stood in long lines for a bowl of soup, and bread was so precious that people cut it into thin slices and dried it to make it last. The irony was painful. The men who had once mocked Allied food as tasteless now returned to a homeland where there was no food to laugh at. At first, some POWs struggled to adjust. They told stories of the meals they had eaten in captivity, the porridge, the stews, the endless bread and coffee. Their families listened with disbelief. One woman in Frankfurt reportedly said to her returning husband, "You were fed by the enemy better than by your own." He didn't answer because it was true. A former corporal, released from a camp in Kansas, wrote in his diary, "In America, we ate like men. Here, we eat like ghosts." Some former POWs tried to share what they had learned. They spoke of the Americans' discipline, their organization, their fairness. They told neighbors and friends that the Allied soldiers were not barbarians, but builders, men who could destroy in battle and rebuild in peace. It wasn't an easy message to deliver. Germany was still covered in rubble, still haunted by pride and shame. But slowly, the idea began to take root. That respect could be earned not through conquest, but through compassion. A young German teacher in Hanover, whose brother had returned from an American camp, later said, "He told me that the Americans fought with full stomachs and clear minds. They fed their prisoners because they believed war should end with peace, not revenge. That changed how I saw them in villages and towns across Germany. The returning prisoners began to reshape their lives. Some worked in reconstruction, clearing rubble, laying bricks, repairing roads. Others became farmers, carpenters, or mechanics, grateful simply to build instead of destroy. But many carried invisible scars, not from wounds, but from lessons. They remembered how they had laughed at Allied food, certain that German order and precision would always triumph over American excess. Now they saw how wrong they had been. One former officer, interviewed years later, said quietly, "We mocked their coffee. We mocked their canned meat. We thought it was primitive, but in the end, their simplicity won. It fed them, it fed their allies, and in the end, it fed us." Historians would later call this period the Hunger Years. Between 1945 and 1948, millions of Germans survived only because of Allied relief programs, the same allies they had fought. American and British food shipments poured into devastated cities under the Marshall Plan, bringing flour, sugar, canned goods, and milk powder. For those who had once been POWs, it was a haunting echo. The same white stars that had rolled across Europe in tanks were now painted on the sides of trucks, bringing food to starving families. And sometimes when those former POWs saw the American soldiers unloading the supplies, they remembered the taste of that first bread they'd been given behind barbed wire. They remembered their pride and their hunger. Some wept, some saluted, some simply stood in silence, unable to reconcile the two worlds, the world of arrogance they had left and the world of mercy that had saved them. One former prisoner later said in a BBC interview, "We thought the Americans had conquered us with their bombs, but they conquered us with their kindness." In many ways, the food itself became a symbol of post-war redemption. American powdered eggs, flour sacks, and tins of butter became common in German kitchens. Housewives reused the sacks to make dresses for children. For the first time, Germans began to see those once ridiculed foreign rations as sustenance, not symbols of defeat, but of survival. Years later, when peace had settled and Germany began to rebuild, many of those former POWs would teach their children an unusual lesson. That humility, not pride, is what keeps a man alive. They no longer told stories of victory or glory. They told stories of hunger, in the hands that fed them when they least deserved it. One wrote to his son decades later, "You will read about our tanks, our guns, our marches. But remember this, what saved us was a bowl of soup and the man who offered it." By the end of the 1940s, the war was no longer a story of triumph and failure, but a story of transformation. The Germans who had once laughed at Allied food now taught their children never to laugh at another nation again. Their pride had been reduced to rubble, but from that rubble came something stronger: understanding. By the 1950s, the world had changed. The ruins were being cleared. New buildings rose where the old had fallen. But among the millions of stories buried beneath the rubble of war, one quiet lesson endured. A lesson carried home by the German prisoners of war who had once laughed at their enemies' food. They had gone to war believing in superiority, in their machines, their discipline, their culture. They mocked everything the Allies stood for, especially the food that fueled their armies. Canned meat, powdered eggs, white bread. These were, to German officers, proof of a crude and soulless people. But in the camps, when the laughter faded and the hunger set in, those same men discovered something they had never understood: sustenance without pride. Every ration of bread, every ladle of stew, every cup of coffee became a quiet revelation. The Americans, they realized, didn't cook to impress. They cooked to sustain. In letters written from those camps, there was a strange humility. One prisoner in Texas wrote home, "Their bread is plain, their meals are simple, but they eat together, officers and men alike. They don't fear hunger because they know how to share." Another, held in Scotland, confessed to his brother, "We mock their food. Now I see it feeds not just the body, but the spirit. We were too proud to understand that." These words, written by men who had once seen themselves as the finest soldiers in Europe, carried a truth that would echo long after the last battle ended. When the war finally ended and the prisoners returned home, they brought more than memories. They brought a new understanding of humanity, one forged in defeat, softened by kindness, and shaped by hunger. They told their children and grandchildren not of triumph, but of mercy, of the taste of bread shared by the enemy, of the hands that offered food instead of revenge. In post-war Germany, this memory became part of a quiet moral rebuilding. The Marshall Plan fed not just a broken nation's stomachs, but its conscience. And in that recovery, the same food once mocked as inferior became a symbol of survival, of peace. For many, the lesson lingered for the rest of their lives. One former POW, interviewed in the 1970s, said simply, "I used to think strength meant never bowing your head, but I learned it means knowing when to thank the man who feeds you." Another, who had served as a tank officer in France, told his grandson, "They fed us when they could have starved us. And that is why they won, not because of their weapons, but because they never lost their humanity." Historians later called this the quiet victory, the moral triumph that came not on the battlefield, but in the aftermath. The Allies had shown mercy where hatred might have been expected. They fed their enemies. They healed those who had fought them. And that act, simple, uncelebrated, profoundly human, changed the world far more than any tank or bomb. In a way, the story of the German POWs and the food they once mocked became a parable of the 20th century. It was about pride and hunger, arrogance and humility, and about how the simplest things, like a bowl of soup or a slice of bread, can become instruments of transformation. The laughter that had once filled officers' mess halls, full of scorn for inferior meals, had been replaced by something quieter: gratitude. Decades later, those same men would visit the countries where they had been imprisoned. Now allies, not enemies. They stood in front of the old camp gates, not in shame, but in reflection. Some laid flowers, some brought bread. One elderly veteran, visiting a former POW camp in Georgia, placed a loaf of bread on the ground and said, "This saved my life, and it taught me how to live." It was not just a story of war, It was a story of redemption, how the defeated learned that true strength lies not in conquest, but in compassion. The Germans had once laughed at Allied food, the symbol of what they believed to be weakness. But in the end, that food, that generosity, that simple act of feeding the enemy became the quiet proof of victory. The war ended long ago, but its echoes remain. The laughter is gone, replaced by remembrance, and the taste that endures, the one that outlasted arrogance, hunger, and war, is the taste of humility. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.